Authority, which if you have one of those very large budget books in front of you is, the information from them is listed on page J66 and following. And I will turn your mic back on and if you need PowerPoint assistance, Ms. Hayes is your expert, but if you're just talking, then we got the mic.
Well, I think there was a presentation that went to Ms. Godin. Danielle? I mean, I have handouts if that would help.
If you want to.
As a backup, how's that? It's kind of a short version.
Thanks, we'll get those handouts going and then
Okay.
if we can get the presentation going. Thank you so much for being here, and if you'll introduce yourself and that should be on.
Hello? On? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so we,
All right, I just wanted to let you know that Dr. Webb could not be here today. Like many of you guys, he has a daughter who just finished her master's degree. She is relocating to Texas for her first job out of college. So he couldn't be with you today. He sends his regrets, and he sacrificed me in his place.
duly noted.
So just the first thing, we did respond to Ms. Godin's request, at Berkeley Allen's request. So we did send the questionnaire back with our responses because I think those are really good questions for everyone to have handy. I can either walk through them or I can go straight to the book that you have in front of you. You should have with you.
It's in the SharePoint.
Yeah, if you want to,
It's in the SharePoint.
it's, yeah, the questionnaire.
Presentation that you sent in is in
Yeah,
the SharePoint.
this one, it's in the
Okay.
chat.
All of that is in the
Okay.
SharePoint.
Is in the, so if you have a computer up, you can access it in the.
Well, if y'all have access to that, I'd just like to walk through a couple of the questions because I think it'll make reading the booklet a little easier.
And
I'll-
Mr. Nairmore, because we are broadcasting this live, if you'll just say your name and your position so
sorry.
everybody in the world will
Yes,
know.
thank you, Chair.
What your role is.
Bruce Nairmore, I'm the Chief Financial Officer at Nashville General Hospital. Have been there about 5 years in support of the mission over there. As regards the questionnaire for Budget and Finance Committee, it said, did last year's budget 2022 enable your department to satisfactorily fulfill its mission? And if not, why or why not? And I'll just say our FY 2022 budget, which you'll see back in the book, eventually I'll cover it, is going to leave us in a financial hole probably in the range of $4 to $5 million for the current fiscal year that ends June 30th. And it's primarily, we are a hospital and we have to take the patients as they present. We can't control the cost of pharmacy. I don't know if any of you are in that business, but our pharmacy costs just in our hospital where we have a pretty big oncology program are up 60%. That's not utilization, that's price. And so that cost us over $5 million unanticipated in our 2022 fiscal year budget. And I don't know if you know anything about the pharmaceutical business, but prices tend to stick and they don't drop. So we're still experiencing that. The other major issue that affected the hospital, and all hospitals, frankly, contract labor for nursing. We have about the same 40 positions in nursing covered through contracts or travelers you may hear. That's not changed a lot over the last few years, but the sticker shock. A year ago, we paid $63 for a med-surg nurse, contract nurse, $66 for a critical care nurse. This past year, it's been $120 for a med-surg nurse, $140 for a critical care nurse. And believe me, we had the cheapest prices because it's basically a bidding war, so the bigger hospitals are able to pay more, and they have cash reserves to handle it. We just don't. So we did the best we could. So that the sticker shock just on price there is about $4.5 million in 2022. So even though we've collected, thus far, we're projecting that we're going to collect our own revenues about $4 million more than the year before. And the mayor last year and council recommended full funding, which we were very appreciative. It was 49.6 that we requested. But even with the full funding and the fact that we collected 52 million or projected to collect 52 million, we're still running a pretty substantial deficit this year. And I know Director Flannery and her team, they sit with us on our calls every Wednesday, and we look at sort of our payables and our cash flow at the hospital. And our payables, which is really the only factor that we have that we can adjust during the year, our payables have gone from about 52 days last fiscal year to about 80 as we stand here today. So my vendors are complaining, and that's just the nature of it. They've worked with us, a lot of them, for a long time. The big vendors that have been historic partners of the hospital, they're used to this process, and they don't go away. The small vendors or local vendors, it's really difficult. We try to put them primary in the payment cycles, but that's the world that we live with. So that's the first question. And then what is the amount of our requested budget modification for 2023? We initially requested a large increase. It was 59.9 million compared to 49.6 to address most of those costs that I just covered. And the mayor initially has recommended a 5% increase to 52.04 million. So now we are looking at service reductions, and I'll walk through a few things that we've done, but we're still about $2 million short at best right now as we stand for the fiscal year 2023. We have to present an amended budget to our board next Thursday with the changes. But some of the program changes required the board's approval. The original request that we sent to the mayor and council included a 5% increase, wage increase for our staff. At the hospital, we don't have steps and COLA. We just have one increase. If you're eligible, you get that increase unless you're on probation, et cetera. So that 5% increase is about $2.2 million. Subsequent to that, with the recommendations from the mayor's office, we're trying to work our way down. So we have actually dropped the annual increase from 5% to 3% because that will save about $900,000 against the budget. Does the mayor's budget include the full amount? No, it was, as I said, 52 versus a $59 million request. So what will we do if the modification request isn't received? Well, first, we've left 15 positions unfilled currently, and we're going to reduce the annual increase for staff from 5% to 3%. And then the others that we've looked at, where we've already got them in the budget that you'll see in front of you, we have a large oncology program at the hospital, medical oncology. We don't do radiation oncology or major oncological surgeries. But working with Vanderbilt over the last few years, they have given us a great rate structure, basically, where if we need a patient that needs to leave our chemotherapy care to go to Vanderbilt to have a tumor shrunk by radiation therapy, they have allowed us to do that and pay them Medicare rates, which is pretty good in this market, pretty inexpensive. But one of the things, technically, we're the hospital district for Davidson County, and you know, the secret is that if we don't have a service at the hospital, technically, it is not the responsibility of the hospital or this council to cover it. So we have taken the position that we're going to pull those referrals back going forward, although I know that sounds somewhat inhumane to my physicians. But it's almost $1 million a year that we pay to Vanderbilt for the care, mostly radiation oncology patients, but there are other services that we don't provide. And we use them and referral to and we try to get those patients back and finish their care at Nashville General. But that's a significant change there. So we're going to have just a medical oncology program only. We would not cover the cost of those oncology referrals outside the hospital. And obviously that's just for charity patients, because if a patient's insured, they'll go to Vanderbilt or St. Thomas or Centennial with their own insurance. The other is, explain a 2% reduction, and was it included? And my only answer to that was that healthcare costs have risen so rapidly, the only realistic option to save 2% would be some of those we've already talked about, dropping our wage increase from 5 to 3%, quit paying for the outside referrals for oncology care, leave the 15, 16 positions unfilled, and then recruiting and retaining our own staff so that we can reduce reliance on that contract labor. We've recruited about 30 new grad nurses in the last 12 months, and that's helping a great deal, but they're not yet at the levels that we need from a skills standpoint to cover yet for those other 40 positions that are currently under contract. What services currently provided by the department would you reduce or eliminate? And the Hospital Authority Board at the hospital and in conversations with Meharry, for many years there's been a discussion about the women's services floor. We lose on the margin about $4.5 million a year to maintain that service. It is a core teaching program for Meharry Medical College. They have 9 OB-GYN residents typically, but we only deliver about 30 babies a month, so some of those students have to go to other hospitals so that they can get enough encounters or presentations for their training program. Doing that is not something, it's been talked about many times over the years, and it's something that we will probably at least discuss possibly at this meeting next week with our board. All the patients in OB-GYN are basically insured. So it's not because they don't have insurance. It's just that it's the teaching program for the Meharry Medical College OB-GYN program. The second, what impact would elimination have on the residents and businesses? OB has been a historic service between NGH and Meharry for over 40 years, but the delivery volumes have dropped about 50%. I used to do 60 to 75 deliveries a month, and now it's around 30. The bulk of the patients obviously are insured, so they could find care elsewhere, but the residency program would have to be relocated, and that is a big undertaking for Meharry for certain. How many department employees do you anticipate will be impacted? Well, 16 is the positions that we have frozen and will not be filled and budgeted as such. The women's services floor has 42 full-time staff. Positions. So if that happened, that would be about 58 staff total, a little over 10% of our workforce. How many budgeted employees? We're about 550 currently. We have about 45 open positions in nursing, but they're all filled by those contract nurses that I spoke of earlier. And then we probably have another 20 or 25 positions in a variety of areas around the hospital that are vacant. How many positions are in the mayor's proposed budget? Well, we froze that 16, so they will not be filled under any circumstance. But the current budget still has the women's services in the budget. So we believe the total FTEs will be roughly 550, flat in terms of bodies, but with a 3 to 5% volume increase inspected in the hospital next year. Previous audits, which your department has participated, the Hospital Authority has its own separate annual external audit by Crossland, and it rolls up into what used to be the CAFR for Metro. Any capital spending been audited? That is part of the external audit. They review, Metro reviews our procurement practices every year or two, and then the external auditors review capital processes, acquisitions, and depreciation. Our 2021 audit from Crossland did note a material weakness in our revenue estimating model, and it was a very unusual issue. It's been corrected, but basically we have to estimate reserves on our patient revenues, and last year we were lucky, as all hospitals were, that charity or uninsured patients actually were reimbursed through United Healthcare at Medicare rates through a federal program paid for with CARES Act money. And so last year we did receive about $4 million for caring for COVID positive patients that would have otherwise not been reimbursed to us. And that changed the way that we typically value uninsured patients is their value is typically 1 or 2 cents on the dollar. And when we started getting these dollars for patients that were bucketed as uninsured, we did not take that into the equation fully enough because we do a 13-month rolling, and it hit us in the middle of the year. We didn't genuflect quick enough for it, and so we ended up undervaluing our revenues by about $4 million last year. It was corrected before the audit was completed, but that was the weakness. It's been corrected, and I think we're in pretty good shape there. So that's the questionnaire. Now if you wouldn't mind, take a quick look at this hospital authority budget package that you have in front of you. Most of you know the charter still requires the city to operate a hospital to care for Davidson County residents who lack access to care. About 40% of our patients fit those charity criteria. It's been in that 38 to 42% range since I've been there for 5 years. We are getting more insured patients in the hospital than we have. We're not turning uninsureds away. We're just growing the insured population. We are and remain the index teaching hospital for Meharry Medical College and therefore programs. If you turn to the next page, there's a hospital annual budget. You can just see what my 2022 fiscal year looks like currently. You can see we budgeted to collect $49 million of patient revenue money. We're actually projecting that we're going to do about $3.5 million better than that by the end of the year. And you can see we're close on the other government funding. Obviously, the subsidy is at the 49.6. So we're actually expecting that we're going to have revenues that are about 3.3 million higher than the budget. The issue is fully in the expense line. The pharmacy cost and the contract labor costs are those two on the right side. You see they add up to just shy of $10 million. If we didn't have those unique, unusual spikes, I think our budget would be really solid this year, but that's what starts the problem. The second issue, if you go to the next page, you see what the 2023 budget is. It's got those same set of numbers in the salmon color for actual and projected this year. Then the original budget that was submitted back in March with $57.4 million produced by the hospital collections, roughly $16.8 million from other government funding, and then the 59.9 request of the subsidy, total of 134. At this time, what the budget represents, and which I will share with the board on Thursday, a week from Thursday, the 57.1 down slightly because we lost one provider, so that revenue is going to go away for that one provider. So we're going to produce still $73.9 million ourselves, and then the number recommended by the mayor is the 52 million. So we're at 125.9 with the 52, and the best we can do right now with all the reductions we've made is 127.9. So we're about $2 million short currently of the budget. So I'm just bringing this as an update. It's not balanced yet. It will be balanced by the time we get to June, obviously. The next page is just a request, just to highlight depreciation at the hospital. Standard & Poor's rates hospitals based on the age of their physical plant. Average grade B basically is 11 years. Nashville Hospital has a 19-year-old average age of plant, significantly old. We keep things running for probably longer than they should be, but we make the best of it. But you can just see the depreciation number across the top, around $5 million. It's dropped off to about $4 million recently. But the capital that we've received through 4% funding is just 20-25% of what would a normal healthy hospital would receive. So I mention that because technically the hospital has not been part of the big capital, the revenue bond piece from Metro, because most of our items are 3 to 7 years in duration, and most of the items that they typically cover through the bonds typically have lives of 15 to 20 to 25 years. And so we have been dependent on 4% money. which is very welcome when it comes, but it comes intermittently, and it's really hard for us to plan to replace items as it goes through time. So just briefly, I won't bore you, but COVID impacts terribly. We've added screeners. We still have screeners in place, although they're slated to disappear July 1st in hopes that this COVID emergency is truly over. But our ER volumes in the hospital and most hospitals dropped pretty appreciably after the pandemic started. People are just fearful to go to hospitals in areas where people congregate that might be sick, so they are avoiding them. Contract labor on the next page, you can just see that's the ICU nurses. I talked about ER and med-surg nurses, even respiratory techs. And the issue is national. I mean, Vanderbilt has the same issue. St. Thomas Ascension has the same. A lot of particularly critical care nurses have left to travel. And you don't have to travel far. You can just travel across town and double or triple your salary by working for one of these agencies. And so you can't blame someone. This is America. But that's what's happened is a lot of critical care nursing has basically transformed into all contract FTEs in most of the hospitals around the country. So just a few other items on the next page. In 2020, with the pandemic fiscal year, our collections actually dropped by about $3 million. Last year, they rose up to $51 million, and then an additional $2.5 million we're projecting this year. And in the budget, we're predicting another $4 million. So basically over 3 years, we're talking about increasing our own self-generated collections by almost $19 million. But the bad items that we've had to face were pharmacy prices have basically doubled over the course of 2 years, about 65% in the last year. And then just the salary increases. Those of you who have businesses, it's extremely difficult. There are very few, it's hard to compete when Target's paying $20 or $22, and that's part of what we face in our unskilled labor force. And then the other point is, you probably heard about it previously, but in 2021 fiscal year, we did receive, 2020, we received $9.4 million from the COVID CARES Act. We expended about $3 million of it in 2020 fiscal year, and the last 7 we had for fiscal year 2021, but then it was completely exhausted before we got into 2022. I think that's why the mayor was good enough to bless our full request last year, the 49.6, and we thought that was significant in terms of support and that it would get us through the year. But with some of those cost increases, I just fear that we're running into some significant problems. So I just want to walk through one more time the changes that are currently in the budget that you have in front of you that we've already put in place. We have dropped the annual wage increase from 5% to 3%. We have eliminated oncology referrals out of the hospital where we would cover them and pay for them. That saves another $900,000. We have 16 unfilled positions. That's about $940,000. We are planning to reduce contract labor by 25% by the end of the fiscal year, which will save another $1.1 million. And we eliminated some of our shuttle valet services effective May 1st. That will save us about $210,000 against the budget. So that's about $4.1 million of savings. We're still about $2 to $3 million short of what we need. I'd like to have a little headroom in case something else bites us during the course of 2023. So that's really my presentation, Madam Chairman. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that information. And I don't think we have our button pushers available, so I'll just be looking for hands being raised. Councilmember Druffel, you're recognized.
Yeah, thank you. What do we pay our nurses if our contract is for an ICU nurse, for example, is $140? What do we pay internally for our nurses?
The quick answer would be that we pay market, Councilman. I would give you averages are about $33 to $45 for our own employed nurses, and obviously they get benefits with that as well, retirement and medical coverage and so forth. So we do pay market rates. I mean, we're very competitive, probably a little higher than Vanderbilt for the same roles, a little, very comparable to what we see in the market. And we look at that real carefully. But
But if just a follow-up continuous question here, because in the hotel business, we had the same problem. We used a lot of contract, but then there's a point where you have to raise your rate to be competitive. So if you're paying $140, but you're only paying $40 internally, I mean, it's a $100 difference. It seems like, I mean, we would just double that or come to a point where we would do it internally, which would save us money because we're paying the contractors to do all the work for us.
right.
And so it just seems exceptionally high to do that because that's $200,000 or $300,000 per person.
Yeah.
So had you ever just thought about simply raising the rate?
We have, but remember, we have 170 other nurses that would similarly expect that same increase, right? So it's 40 out of 210, and it is a little tough. I mean, my family's actually in the hotel business as well, and so we struggled with this in the last 24 months as well as you have.
So then on the regular nurses, the non-skilled nurses or the whatever, how you identify that, then do we have enough regular nurses that are not specific ER, et cetera?
Yeah, the majority of those nurses, those contract nurses that we're filling right now are honestly mostly critical care. So ICU, neonatal ICU, some ER. It's not so much on the med-surg floors, the traditional floors. And then we have a forensic floor where we take care of patients in custody, whether it's state or metro. And that's a tough one because you have to be a special person to want to work on that floor. That's the area where we probably have the most contract labor, those areas, critical care.
So I guess I go back to a parallel is if you're an orthopedic surgeon versus a regular doctor, you get paid more naturally, right? And so it seemed, and I don't know the human resource issues, but it seemed similar parallel as a nurse versus an emergency room nurse. It makes sense that an emergency room nurse then gets paid more, or you go to the market position to pay that person rather than contract, which is really almost tripling or quadrupling the amount we pay. Again, I don't know the HR issues, but logically and from a return, it just makes sense.
Yeah. Just as a reference point, our new grad nursing rate was $23.50 18 months ago for a new grad coming in. It's now $30.
Right. Yeah.
So we are responding, but it's just hard to keep up. And when we raise the base rate, we have to raise everybody who's been with us all that time as well, obviously.
No, I get it. I don't know if you've done a return on making that adjustment to accommodate this, because I would imagine these shortages aren't going away, and then it's going to continue. Therefore, we're just chasing, these rates. And if we did it internally, we'd have our own people. From my experience, it's a lot better for our
it is.
Anyhow.
No, and I just want to tell you one more thing, because my chief nurse would be very ugly with me if I didn't tell you that we actually had some, and we continue to have through April, we did, where we pay nurses $10, $15, $25 extra per hour to take an additional shift beyond the 3 or 4 that they're scheduled to work. So we are doing that, trying to give that money to our own people that cover us every day. It's not quite what you suggest, but that is what we have done. But honestly, after 2 years, a lot of our nurses are just tired. I don't think it's different at Nashville General than Vanderbilt or Ascension. They're just tired. They don't want to work 60 hours. They just don't want to.
And these rates, are these including overtime?
On that, the budget page does?
Yeah, your COVID-19 impact and response, and you talked about how rates have spiked.
No, that does not include overtime. That is just a contract labor solely.
Do we pay the contract labor overtime?
No.
Okay, so that absorbs the overtime.
Right.
Okay, I have 3 other
Thanks.
council
Sorry.
members in the queue. Thank you, good questions. Councilmember Porterfield.
Thank you so very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for this very thorough information. I do just have a few questions for you, and I want to start by saying thank you for the work that y'all do at Nashville General. It's no secret that I had a health scare earlier this year, and I chose Nashville General Hospital for my care, and I received excellent care, excellent service. It is evident that some of the facilities need to be updated, and just seeing it from the perspective of a patient and seeing, what the hospital is lacking and what you all lacked, I will say that you all made up for in care, because the nurses, the doctors, every person that I came in contact with, they were just so kind and so accommodating, and it was evident that they cared about every person, and not me as a council member, every single person that was on that floor. And, being in the hospital for an extended period of time is terrifying. If you push that button overnight and you need medicine or you need water, or, you're in pain and there's no one there to answer that call, it is extremely, it's extremely terrifying. So, I saw firsthand what it was like when there were shortages and when, there weren't enough nurses, and, hearing in the other rooms when people were needing somebody, and it was a very, very terrifying experience. So thank you. I credit Nashville General with saving my life. So thank you all so much.
Well, that's a nice endorsement.
With that, I just have two quick questions. You talked about dropping wages from 5% to 3%, dropping the increase from 5% to 3%. How much did you say that was going to save? Was that $900,000?
Yeah, about every 1% is about 455,000. So,
Okay.
yeah, two would be, dropping it 5 to 3 would save about 910,000 against the budget.
Okay, and then Councilmember Druffel hit a bunch of my questions, and we had some of those same questions last year with the contract labor versus increasing the pay. You also mentioned reducing contract labor was going to save about 1.1 million. Who's going to do that work if you reduce the contract labor?
Well, that's why we have the nurse residency programs. We've recruited in about 30 nurses, but it takes them a while, particularly to go into a critical care area. You don't typically have the first-year nurse working in ICU. They can probably work in the ER, but they can't work in the ICU or the OR probably. And so there are limits, or neonatal ICU, where you have low-weight babies, very low weight. And so those are areas that you really need 2 probably years of seasoning, but it will take care of a lot of our floor contract labor issues. And so I don't think we're going to, I'm not calculating that we're going to save 25% overnight. It's going to be throughout the course of the year. So we're going to spend about $9 million this year on contract labor. That's where the projection is. And so if I can get to the 25% mark by the end of next year, we think we can save about $1.1 million by taking that contract labor out, even if I paid $60 an hour like we used to, because we still have the same 40 contract labor nurses in the hospital. It's the rate that's gone through the roof, not the number of bodies that we have. And so I agree. We've talked about it. That's why we have raised rates so much in nursing over the last year. We're actually a little higher than some of our competitors, but as you mentioned, the conditions at the hospital, great spirit and care, but the technology is a little bit less. So believe it or not, we have to pay a little bit more because Vandy or Ascension are a little bit higher tech, and ours is a little bit more touch, and you have to push a little harder.
Thank you. And then my last question, with the anticipation of a 3% increase as opposed to a 5% increase, do you anticipate that is going to have a negative impact on your staffing? I mean, if I thought I was getting a 5% raise and then I found out I was getting a 3% raise, I don't know how happy I would be.
No, and the 5% that I proposed early on that was in the original budget, the last thing I care to do is to drop that because, right, we all have to pay for gasoline. People have to get to work. Brad Racem, SEIU, they of course say, guys, what can you do to save that 5%? Because it's material. It hits our unskilled or less skilled workforce a lot more than it does our nurses. We update nursing and sort of radiology tech salaries a couple of times a year. But for unskilled people that are less skilled people, I guess I would say, if they work in a food service area or a registration area, those are the people that can just go to work at Target and probably make more money. Maybe they don't get as good benefits as the hospital offers, but in a 2-earner family, that's what we're competing with. And so I don't like going from 5 to 3%, but I've got to get this thing in balance before we get to the end of June, obviously.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, appreciate that. Two more council members. We're running a little over, so if y'all can be succinct, that would be helpful. Councilmember Cash.
Thanks. I want to follow up on the contract labor stuff. So the figures that we're seeing, the 140 an hour and the 120 an hour for ER and ICU, for ICU and ER respectively, that's what we're paying that's what you're paying the contract company, right? Not
Correct.
the nurses themselves are not getting 140 and 120. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so, I mean, I kind of want to ask what are they getting? But I really want to ask, like, the increase from which is for the first two respiratory techs, it looks like it's 3 times, but
Yep.
for the first two, it looks like it's doubling roughly, right? So are the nurses' salaries, what they're getting, is it doubling, or are the contract labor companies like capitalizing on the nursing shortage and getting more than they were? Percentage-wise.
Yeah, I mean, our friends at the Tennessee Hospital Association, because I can only give you anecdotes because I've talked to some of the nurses that work at the hospital in contract spot. They've got some really good ones. Honestly, they do. And I hope when it sort of settles that some of them will join us because I think they like working at the hospital, the mission and that sort of stuff. But what I hear is that nurses are actually getting 2 to 3 times what they had gotten in their previous roles. But who's really making a lot of money, honestly, it is those agencies that are placing these people. So, you know, I've talked to several of our nurses, contract nurses. They typically are going to make something in the range, say in ICU, they're going to make about $75 to $90 an hour, but they also get a stipend. They get a living stipend for traveling. But if you're only traveling from Murfreesboro to Nashville, or, you know, you could literally have been a nurse at Vanderbilt, now you're going to Ascension 2 miles away, but you get the $5,000 a month stipend because that's part of the deal. So that's what's happening. It's like an arms race between the hospitals. And I mean, Vanderbilt and Ascension were paying much higher rates than Nashville General. We just couldn't afford it. And so we would put in our bids and we would not get positions filled until we would get up to that 120, 140. Others were paying $200 an hour for critical care. So I think the agencies were making serious bank over the last 2 years, and I hope they invested their money well.
Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Toombs, last.
Thank you for the presentation. So my question, if I'm understanding the presentation correctly, is that you've identified about $4 million in savings,
Right.
but you still have about $2 million shortfall.
Right.
So how do you plan to balance that out, and will that impact patient care?
Well, honestly, that's the conversation that we have to have with our board on Thursday next week, because service reductions, you know, whether, let's say you've got 3 urologists or 3 orthopedic surgeons. Well, if you take one out, you can probably save some money, but that means the wait for the patients to get in to see that ortho or uro, whoever, I'm just picking them out, is longer. So that's the downside of it. And for insured patients, they can go anywhere, right? They can. Uninsured patients really don't have that choice. So unfortunately, it ends up being the least of us that end up the ones impacted by that. As I said earlier, the 2 that have been talked about for a long time probably have been, because you have to be able to compartmentalize it. I can't close a floor because the ER keeps filling it up, right? So we've talked about the women's services floor over quite a few years, even before I was at Nashville General. And that's still a possibility, but Meharry has 9 OB residents that are depending on being attached to our hospital for their residency program. And that's one of their 4 major programs. So I don't do it to be inflammatory or to irritate Meharry, because we've talked about this over some time. But it is not easy to reattach a residency program to another hospital. It takes a lot of red tape with CMS and so forth. It is not something that's easily undertaken, and it is disruptive. Now, the nice part is that for women's services, virtually every patient that delivers has insurance because of TennCare and other programs. So it's not like they don't have any options, but the impact on the residency program at Meharry is a big concern of my board, of me, of Dr. Webb, that we don't do it lightly. But somehow we got to get this thing balanced. The other thing that we've looked at, like I said, we could drop a doctor or 2 from a service that has more than 1 provider, or the other that we've talked about is we've had an oncology program for 80 years, and Meharry values it. It's not one of their teaching programs, but they value it because they do so much research in oncology and sickle cell and so forth. And they do a good bit of care for patients, and the hospital does infusion, chemotherapy infusion. But because that's sort of an entity unto itself, and some small hospitals don't have oncologists or oncology programs, that's the other one that potentially would be one that we would consider closing. Don't do it lightly, because that's been a historic service for the hospital, but it's one that could be taken off at some point in time. And the pharmacy cost for chemotherapy, that's about 35% of our pharmacy spend every year. So it wouldn't be that I save a lot of money on the 10 or 12 FTEs that work in that space, but the pharmacy savings would be $2 to $3 million a year. But where would those people go that don't have coverage? That's the part that's difficult. Now, I would say, just since you asked, the other thing that I wrote it in, but I'll just mention it. We have some odd things, that have happened to the hospital over the last several years. 2.3 million of our subsidy every year is taken out to pay for legacy Bordeaux and legacy Knowles costs. I don't know how we got tagged with that. I'm not sure why, but if that was just taken out of the general fund and not taken out of the hospital subsidy, that would create some space where maybe we don't have to make program reductions. That's one. The other one, I think last year, 2021, I think the sheriff's office, there's been an intergovernmental agreement between the sheriff and the hospital for many years, where the sheriff provided security at the hospital, and therefore the hospital treated the sheriff detainees, or whatever you want to call patients, for no charge. Well, in 2021, somehow there was a cost-saving program offered up by the sheriff's office, and the cost saving was give that contract to Nashville General. It's about $1 million a year for us to pay. So somehow we got to that, and we still get to take care of the sheriff's detainees at no charge. So those 2 things, one very recent, one more historic, just got dropped on us, and it's difficult. We don't have much room for error, as you probably know. So.
Thank you, Mr. Nearmore. Just one clarification, then we need to move on to the next department. We appreciate this information. Councilmember Porterfield wanted to be sure, was that 2.3 million for Bordeaux and Knowles together or each?
Together.
That's a total.
Together.
Okay.
Together.
That's great. And $1 million for the sheriff. That's very helpful. Okay, hopefully we can help you with that, but we appreciate all the work y'all have done to find savings as well. We know this is all about hard choices, and we appreciate y'all giving us good information to work with.
Thank you very much,
We will
Chair.
see what we can do there. With that, I will ask the emergency communications folks to come on up. Thank you so much.